Welcome to this, the very first installment of the Superpodcast Roundtable. And today we'll be discussing the Fred Blassie fan club, as well as some other things. And I am very, very happy to be joined on the line right now. And I'm going to introduce you guys in the order that you ran the Fred Blassie fan club. No favoritism here. But I am first joined by our friend Jeff Walton. Jeff, welcome back to the program.
Oh, it's great to be back. I thank you for having me this time.
And we are also joined by the man that he handed the fan club off to, John Arezzi. John, welcome back to the program.
Always a pleasure to be here, and it's such a great memory, the great memories I have of Jeff, and it's so wonderful to have him on the same line and talk to him since the 1970s.
Yeah, well, he's a thief anyway. He actually stole the fan club from me. He didn't really, I didn't really get... No, I'm just joking. John was a good guy. He was a young, enthusiastic wrestling fan, and I had just gotten into the wrestling business, and it was a pleasure to, work with John, and John did a terrific job taking over the fan club. He sent me the bulletins, and then, of course, he sent me a bill for the newsletters, but I didn't mind that much, He was just a great guy. Still is.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
How did you guys first become fans of Fred Blassie? What caused you to start the Fred Blassie fan club?
Let me preface this by saying that, it's not like today where you have the internet and you can get information in seconds. This was a thing that was mostly started by women, young girls, for the baby faces. They started clubs, and in order to communicate about their hero or whatever, they would send information out, and if their hero left a territory, usually they started when he was in their territory, they would send information out to where he went, and hopefully they would get new followers to send information back. And that was how you knew what was going on where. So, as you said earlier, the fan club was very, very important to tell, what kind of matches were going on and in the areas that they were happening in. Like up north in San Francisco, they had the Ray Stevens fan club. Joe Potgeiser started a Ray Stevens fan club. I started the Freddie Blassie club in 1961, and we were able to get a lot of fans by the wrestling magazines, because the wrestling magazines, a lot of them had fan club columns. And in the fan club columns, you would be able to see the different fan clubs from Canada, from Europe, from the United States, on all these different wrestlers. And I thought, because my interest was so high in Blassie as a heel that you love to hate, that I would start a fan club for him in 1961. And from there, I got a little blurb of a mention in Wrestling Review in 1961. And that little blurb brought me over 100 people that said, we love Freddie Blassie, how do we get into the fan club? And so I started a newsletter, and I decided, hey, this is pretty good, and I'll do this for as long as I can do it. And when the military service called, that's when I had to kind of give it up for a while. But fan clubs were essential in those days, so that you knew what your hero or your villain was doing around the country. And then, of course, when I got into the wrestling business in the later 60s, around 1967, John came out. You did come out, didn't you, John? You were out here for the wrestling show at the Olympic, and I think
I attended. Yeah, I attended a show. It was in 1974, actually.
Wow.
You and I started corresponding in the early 70s. So, my transition and my love for Freddie Blassie really started when I saw a cover story. I think it was in 66 or 67, where I was really just watching WWF wrestling and Bruno Sammartino and Spiro Sario, and they were my heroes. And I saw a cover story about a riot that took place in Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey, where Fred Blassie was fighting Bruno Sammartino, and he caused a riot there because he kicked Bruno low. And I was like, who is this guy? And then what I started doing was looking at the magazines and any of the back issues. Anything that mentioned Fred Blassie on it, I would order and get these back issues. So I was then caught up to speed with the incredible career that he had. And I became a fan. And then it multiplied when in New York on the Spanish stations, Channel 41, started running the shows from the Olympic Auditorium. And that's where I first saw you on television. And that's when I saw Freddie on TV for the first time. And I was all in. And then he came into New York to start a program with Pedro Morales back in 1971. And that's when I first started going to the live shows because I had turned 14. And I just couldn't wait to see this guy. And I did. And that's when I was like, boy, I would love to get more involved and start a fan club for him. And that's when you and I actually started corresponding. So I had asked for your advice. And you said, well, first and foremost, you got to get a permission slip signed from the wrestler. And I was like, oh, okay. And I had filled one out, and I brought it to Madison Square Garden in December of 1971. And I gave it to the security guard at the dressing room. And I said, I want Fred Blassie to sign this permission slip because I want to start a fan club for him. And security guards looked at me like I had three heads. But one of the security guards was nice enough to take it in the dressing room, and 10 minutes later he came out with a permission slip that was signed by Fred Blassie. And I was like, well, I don't know if this is really signed by Fred Blassie. So that's when I mailed it to you in California. And then you sent me a letter back with a nice package of Olympic Auditorium programs, those cardboard programs that were incredible. And you said, yes, this is his authentic signature. So, he's giving you permission to start this. And that's where it all started for me. And then I put my first newsletter out, King of Men, I called it. And that might have been come from you. And that was in February or March of 72.
You see?
And we were corresponding.
I remember that. Now that you bring that up, I remember that. And
you were so helpful. Always helpful. Always helpful.
Well, again, this was a way of us getting information about what Fred was doing, whether he was going to Hawaii or Japan or whatever. And, I kept his fan club going through a rough period in his life when, he worked in Hawaii, and I believe this was in the late 60s, and he had kidney failure, and he was in the hospital and had his kidney removed. And I got a newspaper clipping, in fact, I think it's in my book, stating the fact that Blassie will not be bad anymore. And this was from Hawaii, and that he had to give up professional wrestling. And everybody said, what are you going to do, Jeff? Are you going to keep the fan club, or are you going to give it up because now Blassie can't work? And I said, well, no, I'm gonna keep it up because this guy is corresponding with me. I got letters from him in Hawaii, and then when he went back to Atlanta after Hawaii, he sent me letters when I'd write him, and he'd say, I'm going to get back in the gym. I'm going to train. I'm not going to let this get me down just because I have one kidney. And this went on for, oh my gosh, I would say a few years, and I kept the fan club up. I let the fans know what Blassie was doing, and at the time he was selling cars for a car dealer in Georgia. Of course, he wasn't happy about doing that, but he brought in a lot of business, and he was making money. But what his real love was getting back into the ring, and he got back into the gym, and he told the doctors, I want to take a chance on getting back into wrestling, and that's exactly what he did. He came back here and had his first match, believe it or not, in San Bernardino against Nick Bockwinkel, and won the match in about a minute and 12 seconds with a spinning neck breaker. And Blassie was back. And I met him at the airport, and I got the biggest hug from him I think I ever got from anybody, because he was still a pretty strong guy, and saying thank you for all the help and keeping my name alive in the wrestling business. And from then on, we were just very, very close.
Jeff, we heard John's story about how he got his permission slip signed. How did you get your permission slip signed to start the fan club?
Well, my very best friend Terry Brote and I, the wrestling was on TV on a Wednesday night, and he came on and yelling and screaming that he's defending his WWA World Title in New Mexico, and he's leaving tomorrow morning to head to New Mexico to defend his title. Well, naturally, we're two young guys. You know, we're out of high school, we're in college, and we believe all this. So we go down to the airport. Terry covers one area, I cover the other area, because we weren't sure he never said what, airlines he would be on. And believe it or not, sure enough, it was later in the morning, we both met up, and as we were talking about, hey, we can't find him, we got there at like 5:30 in the morning, and we looked at all the flights that were headed out to New Mexico, and Blassie came in about 11:30 and walked into the airport. We both met him. I told Terry, I said, he really looks mean, and I really don't want to go up to him. Let's forget about this. And Terry had some balls and said, no, let's go up and talk to him. We came all this way. So we did. We stopped him, and, he had an infectious smile, right, John? When he smiled,
oh, absolutely,
it was a beautiful smile. And all of a sudden, he just broke out in a smile. He said, you two guys came down, and, well, let me give you an autograph and this and that. And I said, what I really want is permission to start a fan club for you. And he said, a fan club? I said, yeah. I said, this way we would, send out news about you and really promote you as much as possible. He said, yeah. He said, that's a great idea. And I said, just, let me know that, you agree to this. And then I sent all the magazines the information and a slip, the copy of the slip that said, Jeff Walton can be president of the Freddie Blassie fan club. And then it really took off, too, from there, And, of course, the mention in Wrestling Review just sent it over the top.
What was the relationship with the magazines like for both of you? When I think fan clubs, the first name I think of is actually Georgianne Macropolis, Georgianne Orsi. She had about 20 different names. But I think about her columns for all the different fan clubs. But what was the relationship both of you had with the magazines and also with the other fan clubs that were in existence?
John, you want to answer?
Sure. Yeah, and I definitely want to just bring up one other point before I get into that, because Jeff was so instrumental in my actually meeting Freddie. As I started the newsletter, I would send Jeff, as he mentioned, copies of King of Men with letters, and I asked him if he could please get copies over to Fred Blassie, and he agreed. And I would certainly love to hear back from Freddie to see what he thinks of the job I'm doing. And one day in the mail, I got a letter, and it was from Freddie Blassie. It was in 1973. It had been a while, and he had written a letter, and he complimented me on the newsletter, and then he told me he was coming back to New York, to Vince, and to work with Pedro Morales again. And I was all excited. And he said, when I show up or when I get there, let's see if we can get together. And it was in a letter. And in March of 1973, I went back to Madison Square Garden to see Fred against Pedro Morales. And I went to the dressing room entrance again with the letter. And a security guard took it in the back. And 5 minutes later, I was waved in, and there he was. And it was an amazing day for me, actually meeting my hero face to face. And I did an interview with him. We took some photos, and it was just, it was great. And as you mentioned, Jeff, Fred would correspond on a regular basis, no matter where he was, to keep you updated on what was going on. And he was truly supportive of that. And I started promoting the newsletter the same way you did, is you send copies to the magazines, and started getting these little write-ups on the Fred Blassie Fan Club, King of Men, and lo and behold, people from all over the world started writing and subscribing to the newsletter. So those interactions with the magazines back in the day, you start to learn to network and know who the editors are and who the fan club columnists are. And that's when I first had the opportunity to correspond with Georgianne Orsi at the time, before she was Georgianne Macropolis. And all of the community, they were also very helpful. And that then led to my being able to submit stories. And the very first story that I got into a magazine was about Fred when he came back to begin his managerial career with Nikolai Volkov. And that was in 1974. So that was my actual first published story on Fred with Nikolai Volkov. And I remember the check. It was $25, and I was thrilled to death.
My story is almost the same. Once I started working full-time on the fan club, and I had people writing into me, and I had also other fan club presidents writing in, and we were exchanging newsletters if they had a newsletter. You got a feel. It's just like John said. It was networking for the time, but it was with snail mail. So, by the time you get an answer back or whatever, things would be over with and done with. But, and a lot of times you wouldn't know that there was a big show with Blassie and Bruno at Roosevelt Stadium. And that would be like 3 months after the show took place. I also got started. Lou Eskin, who was the editor of Wrestling Review, asked if I would write some stories about the West Coast wrestlers, which I started to do, and I took my little brownie camera and I went to the Olympic and I took pictures as bad as they were, and he printed, a few of them, and so that's how basically I really got started in the wrestling business. I submitted so many stories and they got published. And like John, my first check from Lou Eskin was for $25, which I framed. I didn't even spend. I framed it. I was so thrilled. Here I was, a professional photographer now and a writer. And then, as things went on, and I went to college and majored in broadcasting. And when I got out, pretty soon after I got out, I got a call from Mike LaBelle, who was one of the big shots at the Olympic Auditorium at the time. He was the treasurer, and he said that his publicity guy for wrestling was going back to the L.A. Herald. They were on strike at the time. And if I wanted to come in and take over the programs and do the programs and do the publicity for wrestling at the Olympic, well, that's like being handed a dream job. Here you love wrestling, and now you're going to be working in it. Well, it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. It was, you had to overcome in those days a lot of prejudice from the people inside the business. They didn't want outsiders really in their business. But after a period of time, you're accepted because of the work you do. And that's what happened. And then I spent all those years at the Olympic wearing a lot of hats, So I owe it all to Freddie. I owe it all to Blassie. Even when he came back to Los Angeles and he worked in the office for a while, I worked right beside him doing the matchmaking or the booking for the various arenas we had in Southern California. So the Blassie fan club really put me on the map.
As it did me, and I just have to tell Jeff one other thing here. As much as Fred Blassie helped you were the person that helped me, not only from getting the validation that it was in fact him who signed the permission slip, to the encouragement, to the passing along of the newsletters to Fred. And then I remember when the Olympic Auditorium programs went from the cardboard, the one actually was two-sided. It was very simplistic, and then you turned it into a newspaper kind of format. And lo and behold, when you first started that, then you did a write-up on the fan club with Fred. And you gave me a big plug in the Olympic Auditorium program, which was amazing to me. So as much as Fred helped you, you helped me get into the business that way. And you gave me the encouragement, and the doors started opening up. And as my career then took off as a writer, photographer, being able to leverage myself to ringside at the Garden. And then I went to college and continued my journey and started a radio show at my college station. And I just proceeded from there. But I know I owe an enormous amount of gratitude to you, Jeff.
Well, thank you, John. That's very nice of you to say. It takes talent. There's no doubt about it. If you have the talent, you're going to succeed. And I always knew that you were the kind of person that would be able to succeed in the business. And I know for a long time you were in the wrestling business. But it's a very difficult business to be in. And as I found out as the years went by, doing all kinds of things, even getting into the ring when I was in Tennessee as manager Tux Newman, I was on the other side of the fence. I was on the fence I was on the area that the boys were, and it was a whole different life for me. And so I know what it is, and it's very difficult, and you've got to have the talent. And I always believed if somebody had the talent, that they should be supported. And like I said, I still remember your newsletters. Mike Tenay, who was the announcer for Impact and TNA Wrestling, I used to bring him into the Olympic Auditorium, and we used to print his newsletter on our old mimeograph machine. And for those of you that don't know what a mimeograph machine is, it's a stencil that goes around a cylinder, and you type on the stencil, and then you have, as you rotate the cylinder, it prints the news on sheets of paper, and that's what we called our newsletters or whatever. So it was very primitive, or sounded very primitive for the 60s and 70s, but that's the way it was done, and that's the way you did your promotion in wrestling.
John, how did you print your newsletter?
Mimeograph. I had a friend of mine who was a huge Bruno fan, and he was a high school wrestler. His name was Bob Coletti, and his dad had a printing shop, and he started printing my newsletters on mimeograph paper. And then my dad, he was working for a trucking company at the time, and he had a Xerox machine and where he worked, and that was able to actually duplicate photographs. So that's when I incorporated actual photographs inside of the newsletter. And I always put a color picture, like a color picture on the cover of the newsletter. I always gave 1 or 2 3.5 by 5 pictures of Fred on the cover of the newsletter. But inside the newsletter, I think it was issue 5 or 6, that we actually now had pictures in it. And that was a huge step up.
In terms of the other fan clubs that existed when both of you were operating the Fred Blassie fan clubs, what fan clubs were there? Were there ones that you particularly liked? Were there ones that you would work with? What was the scene?
Well, as I said earlier, the fan clubs were really started by women. They idolized these wrestlers. A lot of times they went with the wrestlers, they dated the wrestlers, and they were so enamored with a lot of these guys that they started these clubs. They started because they wanted to push the guy, and that's how it was. And as we got into that was like in the late 50s, into the early 60s, it was kind of rare for a guy to be a president of a fan club. But taking Blassie, who was a known heel, there was no babyface type of connotation with him at that time, was different. So, the other clubs, you got a lot of letters from a lot of these women that had clubs for like Tony Parisi, Red Bastien. You had fan club presidents in Texas that were for the Von Erichs. For Fritz von Erich at the time, I remember my association, because we were so kind of close, for years was with Joe Potgeiser in San Francisco, who promoted the Ray Stevens fan club, and that was a very well-known fan club. And so there were a lot. Georgianne, of course. I got letters from Georgianne. Lou Zachow in New Jersey had a fan club for, I believe, Spiros Arian. And so that's how, you met these people, and they would send you information and little tidbits, or if they went to the matches, they would send you the results, so you were able to print the results in there. And I didn't do a lot of corresponding with a lot of these people because I mainly wanted to push, of course, Blassie. But I would get their fan club information. And if it had anything with Blassie, of course, I would utilize it for my members as well.
Yeah, I'm in the same mindset as Jeff. I did correspond with Georgianne, but mostly what I was looking for when I got in was the results and the other territories and what was going on in those other territories. So I was corresponding with people who had those types of newsletters. Michael Mansky in New Jersey, who is a friend to this day. I remember his newsletter. I don't know if it was called Wrestling Roundup, but there were several publications that we used to exchange newsletters, and I would go after the ones that specifically talked about the other territories. I think in regard to individual wrestlers, I think Bruno was the one that I subscribed to. I think that Spiros Arion as well, because he was a favorite of mine back in the day. But for the most part, it was the newsletters with results and the information about what was going on in other parts of the country.
Jeff, when did you stop operating the Fred Blassie fan club?
Well, I basically stopped just before I went into the service. When I did get out, I of course kept in touch with Fred, and but I basically stopped around, I would say, the mid-'60s, but still kept in touch with Fred and kept doing periodical newsletters to send out to the list that I still had of members so that I could keep them apprised of what was going on. There was a gentleman by the name of Bert Ray, and Bert Ray published a huge, thick monthly result sheet. It was kind of a precursor to the Wrestling Observer and all the other newsletters that are still around today. But Bert would compile all these results, and in exchange for my newsletter, he would send me Matt Mania. In fact, when I went to the matches, I used to take copies with me that he would send me, and I would sell them there so that people who were kind of in the know at the time or wanted to be in the know were able to see where a lot of the wrestlers had gone from Southern California. That was about the main thing in those days, Matt Mania.
Between the time that you stopped actively running the Fred Blassie fan club and when John started it up, there was a big change in Freddie's career. Of course, John, when you first see him in New York in 1971, Fred is a heel. He's going against the very popular Pedro Morales. But in Los Angeles, he had finally had that big baby face turn, and to this day, Fred Blassie versus John Tolis is one of those legendary feuds that everyone talks about. So what was it like when you finally see babyface Fred Blassie, Jeff? And John, to you, did you see that stuff on the Spanish channel in New York when he was a babyface?
Let me just say that I don't think Fred ever considered himself a babyface. It's kind of like what it is today, where it's kind of undescript as to what they are. Are they a babyface? Are they a heel? Fred, for a while, the office decided that, well, we've got Tolis in here. He's a great talker. He's a great heel. So Blassie being in here or coming in periodically, we decided that, maybe we could sell Fred to the Hispanic population that was growing here in Southern California, and get him to be a babyface. So Fred would get this serape. He went out and bought this beautiful serape and this sombrero, and he came on TV, and he was the same Blassie, but this time he wanted all his amigos to come out and support him. So it gave him that babyface type look. And, of course, when we're on the Spanish International Network, this was a big hit. People were able to see it on the East Coast, and they go, wait a minute, this guy is a good guy, But in reality, Fred was Fred, always. Don't you think, John?
Yeah, it's the same as Jeff was saying. I mean, I was able to see those tapings from the Olympic Auditorium, and he was cheered, and he was the baby. He was a baby. Well, he was a baby face, even though his style didn't change. And then simultaneously, when he would come to New York, especially when he came in for that first Morales program, they promoted him in such a way that he would be blacked out. They put a big X on the screen when he started biting the jobber's forehead to build him up. And then on Saturday night, you turn on Channel 41, and there he is being cheered by everybody. So it was really strange, and it just added to the lore of who this guy was. And he was one of the most explosive personalities ever. And for as much as the Mexican fans loved Fred Blassie, the Puerto Rican fans in New York almost rioted every time they seen him. They hated him so much.
Right.
Well, he really got that biting over everywhere he went. That became one of the real legacies of Fred Blassie, was he files his teeth. People died in Japan of heart attacks watching him bite Ricky Dozin. That really is one of those things he did that was so brilliant.
Yeah, you're actually covering a very important time. Fred was one of the first, Americans to go over to Japan and work with Ricky Dozan, who was building up the Japanese American style wrestling in Japan. And doing that was just unheard of. The fans had never seen anything like that. And you're right, filing his teeth and then going in there and biting, and of course the amount of blood that they got, which was just horrific to watch on television as far as the Japanese fans were concerned. And then, of course, Ricky Dozan coming here and working with Blassie, it just put a lot of the heels on the map, including, of course, the sensational Intelligent Destroyer, who followed Fred over there and was a tremendous success. But that's another story.
I'll tell you one thing that really stands out in my mind, and Jeff, I don't know if this was the case out in Los Angeles, but Fred Blassie, in his time in the 70s in New York and on the East Coast, never took the 1, 2, 3. He would always get either disqualified or counted out, or there would be a no contest against Morales when he got bloodied up, so they stopped the match. And it wasn't until late 74 when he was managing Volkov, and there was a tag team match at Madison Square Garden where he teamed up with Volkov against, I believe it was San Martino and Chief Jay Strongbow, where Fred actually did got pinned 1, 2, 3 in the middle of the ring. That was the only time I'd seen it.
Yeah, that was.
So he protected himself very, very well.
That was later in his career too, and where things were starting to happen, and he had to slow down. But that it was actually the same out here. In order to protect someone, and especially Blassie, the finishes sometimes were not always 1, 2, 3. They're like John said, they were disqualifications or double disqualifications or stopping for blood, or whether he fought Victor Rivera out here or Ray Mendoza or whoever it was. It was the same story out here, but it still got him over it. And even though he would say lose because he was disqualified, it just put more heat on him.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I remember the second match with Morales, and that was billed as a Roman gladiator death match to the finish. And everyone expected, all right, this is going to be a fight to the finish. And And that's when Fred, he was not carried out of the ring as they had promoted, but it stopped for blood. And then Fred, left the ring and just walked back into the dressing room and was not carried out. And that was the finish of the Roman Gladiator death match, which I remember. But the Garden crowds were explosive. And I just can't tell you enough on how volatile those nights were, because at any given moment, you knew that these fans who were like just kind of rushing the ring and there were the barricades around it, they wanted him dead against Pedro Morales. So those were probably the biggest and most volatile crowds I had ever seen.
Jeff, you know a little bit about the Roman Gladiator death match, don't you?
Yes, I do. I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I have to on that one. That's the one that I created out here. And but that Roman Gladiator death match, how it should be is, of course, dragging your opponent around the ring and touching each ring post and finally getting to the final ring post, and of course something happens or whatever. But that was the way it should have been done. But it just creates a lot of heat, and that's the whole idea of everything. I remember, real quick, a short story. I was in Tennessee, and I was in the ring, and I was a manager, and I was beating up on Jerry Lawler, and they started to swarm the ring, and come in, and I managed to get out of the ring, and a fan threw a cup of beer at me, a wadded up cup, and I went after him because there was no security around, and I shoved him into the bleachers, and then I went back to the dressing room, and I'm yelling and screaming, this is ridiculous, there's no police, there's no thing, and Tom Ernesto, who was the booker, was laughing his head off. He was hysterical, and I got madder for that. I said, what are you laughing at? I could have been killed out there, and Tom's laughing even harder, and I said, Tom, this is not funny. And he came over to me and he said, Jeff, he said, you did your job. That's what you're supposed to do. And all of a sudden in my head, I'm going, wait a minute, I'm not Jeff Walton, the nice guy. I'm Tux Newman, the rat manager, who kicked Jerry Lawler low and the whole thing. And, it dawned on me, that's the key, to get them mad, to get them riled up, And that's what happens when you do that, So can you imagine a guy like Blassie that night after night, that was his job, and night after night, he got tremendous amounts of heat. This was a heel that was just super, super special. He could sell and sell and sell, and somehow he got his hand raised, and that made people furious. That was the type of guy he was.
One of the things people most often think about when it comes to Fred Blassie is the phrase pencil neck geek. Being that you both ran his fan club, at any point were you called a pencil neck geek by Fred Blassie himself?
No, never.
No.
Never.
No.
However, he did record a record years ago, and I was one of the backers for that record. Johnny Legend was the instigator in that. For Rhino Records. If the fans want to really look around, they might be able to find a copy, and it was called Pencil Neck Geek. And Blassie just mouths, of course, these words that Johnny Legend wrote, and it was a hit song for a little while. Dr. Demento, if fans remember the character Dr. Demento, he played it on his radio show on the East Coast, and it was very, very popular.
And the B-side was called King of Men.
Yeah, King of Men was on. See, I was trying to think what was on the other side. You're right. Right, John.
Jeff, you mentioned how it got to a point where Fred was working in the office for a time with you, and I think a lot of people think of him as being closely aligned with the Los Angeles office. And John, of course, Blassie, when he comes to New York, finally, for that last time in 73, and I say last time because he never left after that point, he was an older guy, and he had a job for the rest of his life with Vince McMahon Sr. and later Vince McMahon Jr. What was it about Fred Blassie that endeared him to the wrestling offices that he ended up having such close relationships with?
Well, I know that the McMahon family on the East Coast, at least, fell in love with Freddie, and the kids, Shane and Stephanie. I mean, he was beloved. He was a family member to them. He endeared himself, and for whatever reason, I mean, he was a great man. He was someone who was larger than life, and why not make him a part and give him a lifetime job when he decided to settle down here on the East Coast? And to this day, I know for a fact that Vince McMahon just loved Freddie Blassie. It's the way he's still in the opening of every single TV show. And those kids, Shane and Stephanie, loved this man like he was their own grandfather to the very day he passed away.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with John more. And actually, I think Blassie was one of the first. Senior totally loved him, and why not? Blassie made Senior a lot of money when he left here and went to New York. And believe me, Fred did not want to leave Southern California. He loved it here. He wanted to, as we say in the business, homestead here. But of course, he had been here for so long that in order to make some money, our office said, Fred, you this is a chance for you to make big money on the East Coast. And once he started to draw the kind of houses that he did on the East Coast all over, he really was a favorite of Senior's. And Junior at the time, of course, too, admired him, always admired him. And so that when his days were slowing down and he was slowing down, it was just decided on their end, hey, come on out here. And his wife Miyako opened up a beauty shop, and it was decided that Fred could do a lot of good for them, working in the office, doing the promotional radio work, television work, and of course managing as he did in later years in his life as long as he could. And as he got older and wasn't able to travel too much anymore, he did a lot of the phone calls and the promotions of the shows from his home. And Vince Sr. made Vince Jr. promise, take care of Fred. And that's exactly what happened. And in that way, like John said, he was part of their family.
A few more questions before we wrap things up today. If I was a member of either of your versions of the Fred Blassie fan club, how much would I pay for an annual membership, and what would I have received?
Well, in my case, I had pens printed up. So what you got was a Freddie Blassie fan club pen or pencil, depending upon how rich I was at the time. And you got a year's subscription to the newsletter whenever it came out, which was maybe once a month or once every other month. You got a fan club card that was printed on glossy paper that said member, of the Freddie Blassie, worldwide Freddie Blassie fan club. That's what I called my club. And, of course, I answered all the mail that I got, questions that I got. And that was basically it. You know, we didn't have a lot of money. I know, and John was very young at the time. We really didn't have a lot of money to shell out to give fancy stuff, you know. But it was a thrill to get an envelope with. I know that I heard back from a lot of my members. Oh, the pen is great. If it writes, you know. The pen is great. The card is good. I put that in my wallet, and I'm looking forward to getting the newsletter, you know. So that was about what I sent out, and I think I charged about $3, something like that at the time, to send that out.
And that's probably over a year, because I charged $5 a year.
Yeah.
And you'd get your newsletters. You'd get 1 or 2 photographs on the cover. You would get the official fan club membership card, and that's what you got. And we sent it out. Try to send it out as frequently as possible, but as Jeff mentioned, I was a 16-year-old kid, 15-year-old kid, and didn't have any money, and you sent it out on a regular basis. And finally, I think my last newsletter was published right before I entered college, and that was the end of it. And then ironically, one of my fan club members was a young kid named Paul Heyman. And I think he then took over the fan club after I stopped it, or it just ceased. And I believe Paul had fan clubs for the three managers, which was Fred Blassie, Captain Lou, and I believe Grand Wizard of Wrestling. But I remember Paul Heyman joining the Fred Blassie fan club back in the day.
Wow.
That's a great story in itself.
Yeah, it truly is. Guys, as we wrap things up, when was the last time you spoke to Freddie, and how would you like to see Fred Blassie remembered by wrestling fans today?
The last time I saw Fred in person was in the 80s, and I had been out of the wrestling business, and out of the wrestling business before I went back into it in 89. But this must have been around 84 or 83. Whenever that angle took place with Andy Kaufman and Lawler, because that George Napolitano invited me to the Garden. I went backstage, and there was Fred Blassie, who gave me this, like Jeff said, this tremendous hug. He was so happy to see me, and Paul Heyman was there in the back shooting pictures, and there was a famous picture of me and Fred Blassie and Andy Kaufman, who was a huge Blassie fan, as you all know, and snapped that picture. That was the last time I had seen Fred in person. The last time I spoke to Fred was on my radio show on Pro Wrestling Spotlight, and this was, I believe it was 1990 or 91, when there was a 2 or 3 month détente period between me and the WWF, where they actually agreed to provide Fred Blassie as a guest, a 2-hour guest on Pro Wrestling Spotlight. And that was the very last time I spoke to him.
Jeff, what about you?
Well, I had seen, there was a show in Anaheim, California, and this was probably in the 90s, and Blassie had come out and was going to work the show, and we decided we would meet him for lunch at the hotel. So I went out there and I met him, and at the time he was beginning to get a little uneasy on his feet. He was in a wheelchair, and we met in the restaurant, and we talked. We had a great time. We had lunch, and we just talked about the old days, and he was so glad to be back in Southern California. And in a matter of weird luck, I did in June of the year that he passed away, early June, about 3 weeks before he passed away, I did the last interview with him. I happened to be substituting for Mike Lano on a local radio station here, hosting it, and it was close to Fred's birthday. Actually, I guess it was in February, because his birthday was in February. And we decided we would see if we could get Fred and Tolis on. Tolis would surprise Fred on this last radio interview. So I got Fred on. We were talking about the old days. We were talking about the matches he had with John Tolis. And at the right time, I switched Tolis on, and Tolis started to insult him, and they started to get into an argument on the radio with each other. And it's a classic interview. I still have it. And you could tell the love for these guys. And at the very end, both of them were just so thrilled to hear each other's voices. And it was only a matter of weeks after that Fred passed away.
I guess it's a pleasant surprise from Tolis when it's just a phone, because then you don't have to worry about the Monsels powder happening.
Been there, done that, as they say.
How would you guys like to see Fred Blassie remembered by wrestling fans?
I think Fred should be remembered in the highest regard. I'm thrilled that they, as John said, they still show a picture at the beginning of the WWE show. And I think that's terrific. And I know he's probably in their Hall of Fame, which is good. But I still think that they should maybe have a segment where, they bring up a lot of these old-timers that are now passed away, and so that the younger generation will be able to see and appreciate these guys. I know the network has a lot of tapes, and they can go onto it and they can see it, and that's probably the best way to do it. But Fred was something really special, and I don't think at the time there was Buddy Rogers, Fred Blassie, and Ray Stevens. Those were the big three blondes. And I think all of them are very special to the wrestling business because they drew tremendous houses wherever they went. And Fred should be noted for that and remembered for that.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff. Fred definitely should be remembered and revered for who he was, how much business he did across the world, not just on the East Coast or the West Coast, as someone truly special. And one of the greatest heels who ever stepped inside the ring, and one of the greatest baby faces that stepped inside the ring as well on the West Coast. And with the WWE Network, I just wish that there would be more content on Fred Blassie on the network, because I know those old matches, there's very few of them. A handful may exist, but in those archives, I would love to see them uncover more of those so the fans of this generation can truly see what a great performer Fred Blassie was.
I agree, 100%. That's the way it should be. And the wrestlers themselves could learn from some of these old-timers, and especially Blassie. How to sell, how to get heat, what's cheap heat, what's not cheap heat. There's so much to learn from these outstanding veterans.